Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Matthew 16:24. The title of this talk is called Suffering, Healing, and Hope. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabriel Lopez, and to give you a very brief summary of my life, I'm a native Houstonian. I come from a large Hispanic family. Catholicism was pretty much fed to me from a very young age, along with lunch and dinner. And for that, I am eternally grateful. I completed all of my sacraments as expected, and I remember much of my youth was spent at the church or around church functions. My parents always volunteered for ministries and were always involved in some way. In short, I kind of just grew up in the faith. I was always around it in some way, and I feel it made a tremendous difference in my life. There have been many seasons in my life. I've had my share of heartbreaks. I've had 3 major surgeries, so I'm familiar with chronic pain and the patience and battle it requires. But the best message I could give to you today about suffering, hope, and healing is something that I experienced 15 months ago. On December 8th, 2021, I felt my first symptoms of COVID. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Matthew 6:25. Suffering. I don't have time to give you a day-by-day play, but by day 10, I drove myself to the emergency room. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and I was feeling very weak. I didn't know what else to do. The hospitals had already begun to see a surge of COVID patients and weren't admitting anyone unless their oxygen level was below 90. Mine was not. I was prescribed a high dose of Tylenol for the headache and probably something for nausea. They told me before I left, it's okay if you can't eat anything. Just stay hydrated and drink water. I said okay. On the way home, I stopped by Walgreens and bought an oxygen meter to watch my oxygen levels. At this point, I had unfortunately given COVID to my mother, who in turn had given it to my father. I can only assume it was not one of the weaker strains because it was vicious. My sister, who probably got COVID from where I did, going out to eat, was obviously staying away from us, but once she tested positive, she came to stay with us. We already all had it. The strategy was to just take care of each other until we got better. 2 days later, I'm checking my mom's oxygen with a finger oxygen meter I had bought. It says 86%. I check it again because if it's really below 90, I have to take her to the emergency room. She sits up on the bed. She looks weak and tired. Her face is expressionless. Many of you probably know the shortness of breath COVID can bring. It wakes you up at night because you feel like you're not getting enough air. After checking it again, my mother's oxygen was still 86%. She had to go to the emergency room. I was still very sick and still weak. At this point, I was maybe eating 2 to 3 Jell-O cups a day, and that's basically just sugar and water. I felt so weak and nauseous, but I drove her to the emergency room and waited till she was admitted. 2 days later, my dad drove himself to the emergency room. He hadn't eaten in a few days and in general was feeling pretty terrible. It's December 21st. At this point, I hadn't eaten much in 4 or 5 days. And worse, I could no longer drink water. I would take a sip of water and feel nauseous. I had been texting people, letting them know what was going on and to pray for me. But after a while, I stopped because it became really frustrating. People would say, You need to do this. You need to go get this. You need to go see a doctor. I'm sure they meant well, but I was so nauseous I couldn't even talk. Getting up and walking to the bathroom was so draining because I hadn't eaten. I had no energy. It was such an odd experience because my mind was empty and void of the everyday thoughts of the normal human experience. My only thoughts were breathe, don't throw up because you're dehydrated, and survive. 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 Those are literally the only things I could think about. On the night of December 21st, I couldn't keep anything down anymore. I started throwing up everything, which was pretty much nothing except fluids. I was so weak, vomiting had caused me to fall to the floor. I was holding myself up with one arm and I couldn't move from that position. And as I'm looking at the fluid leave my body, I remember feeling very upset and hopeless because I knew my body needed this fluid. My mother and father were still both in the hospital. And the situation, not only at this moment, but many moments through this experience, felt like we're dying. My family is dying. I had no power to change the situation. The situation was happening to me, and I had no control over it. All I could do was sit there on the floor and be still. Surrender. One of the effects of COVID is the fear, the loneliness, the isolation. People can't come to help you or look after you because you might give it to them. I realized that if I didn't get better and find a way to start drinking water again, I would probably be dead in 2 days. The body cannot survive more than a few days without water. That's the realization I came to as I just sat there on the ground and tried to understand that this may be the end for me. And the fear settled in. Surrender. The night came and went, and by the grace of God, I was able to get a teledoc visit the next day. I was prescribed some steroids, and a family friend from church went to pick them up. And slowly, by the end of the day, I could drink water. I never felt so grateful and thankful to drink water. We don't know how much the most simplest things in our life matter until we can't do them anymore. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and His grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God which is with me. 1 Corinthians 15:10. On December 22nd, my father came home from the hospital. He couldn't get admitted because his oxygen wasn't below 90, and unfortunately had been up all night waiting to be seen. As bad as I felt at times through this experience, my dad was worse. As I started to feel a little better, I knew I had to help my father. He couldn't give himself medicine or feed himself. But every time I would get up, I felt myself regress. 2 days after I started to kind of feel better, I started throwing up again and feeling terrible. I thought, I'm going to have to go to the ER again. All in all, my father didn't eat for 12 days, and myself 6. I feel we both came close to death. In a span of 3 weeks, I lost 20 pounds, and he lost 30 pounds. The Z-Pack I was prescribed, I needed to get fully well. I gave half to my dad so he could get better. All throughout this time, my brother had been calling the hospital to get updates on my mother. Around December 22nd, we were told that she's doing okay, and that they were going to try to send her home in 2 days on Christmas Eve, but with an oxygen tank to assist her breathing. Not great news, but still good news. On Christmas Eve, my brother calls me and tells me to take the phone to my dad. It's hard to get up because I'm basically bedridden, but I do. At this point, my dad is also kind of bedridden to a chair in his room. I put the phone on speaker and tell my father, "Hey, Michael has an update from the hospital. He tells us that mom is not improving. Her oxygen less stable. And she's being taken to a more intensive ICU. He then tells us the nurse told him we should be prepared." At that moment, my dad just lost it. Now it's always a little mystifying seeing a grown man cry, but seeing your father break down in tears, sob and moan, it does something to you. Now I have to back up a little bit. For the previous year and a half, my mom's family and our immediate family had been going through a lot of drama. There were some very stern differences of opinion about a situation that had been introduced into our family, and lines were drawn. While in the beginning, many had objected, my immediate family was the only one who stood their ground. We said no. No matter what, this is not right. My mother suffered a lot for it. Her family blamed her and at times attacked her because our family was kind of staying away from them and not talking to many of them. Coming back to me, there was many in my family that I just flat out avoided. Like, I don't even know who y'all are anymore. I can't believe y'all would cooperate with evil like this. Many weren't saying nice things about me, but I didn't care to talk to them anyway. But on Christmas Eve, when we got this scare, my brother called my mother's family to let them know about the situation and how it was going. And all of a sudden, people who hadn't been previously talking were now talking. If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. 1 Corinthians 13. Healing. The next day was Christmas Day. There was no tree up. There were no presents. There was no Christmas spirit to be had. And by this time, we were not only running out of food, but running out of food we could eat. And the situation that had gone on with my extended family for the previous year and a half really had hardened my heart. Spoiler alert, my family ended up being right about the situation and were eventually vindicated, so that's a yay. But my heart was still hardened for a time. On Christmas night, the doorbell rang. I wasn't feeling any worse, but still not better. Getting up and walking was a chore. I answered and opened the door, and I see bags of groceries. One of my aunts and uncles had gone to every CVS and Walgreens they could find. The only stores open on Christmas. To get us as many electrolyte waters they could find, which we badly needed because we were all very dehydrated, along with food, snacks, and medicine. I look up and I see my uncle standing a safe distance across the driveway, and he gave me a wave and a smile. Now, I hadn't really talked to my aunt and uncle in a while, with all this family drama going on. It wasn't really them per se, they just didn't take our side. When they had gatherings, we didn't show up. But here they were, spending most of their Christmas Day, if not all their Christmas Day, to help us. When I saw him greet me with a smile, I felt so ashamed. I tried to wave, but I was so weak, I couldn't raise my arm much. I felt like a hollow shadow of a man. My face fell down towards the groceries again, and I just started to cry. Because I realized Christmas had come. Not only did we receive valuable things we needed, but I learned a valuable lesson that day. You cannot do everything on your own. You need the help of others, especially family. And we are never alone. We're never alone. My mom would have good days in the hospital and bad ones. We would write her notes of encouragement and put them in our mailbox. And my brother would pick them up and drop them off at the hospital so she could read them. At a certain point, my brother got so stressed out, calling the nurse for updates, that I took over. I would call at the end of each shift change to get all the updates I could from the nurse. The biggest sign of her status was her oxygen level. At this point, I still had COVID. I didn't test negative till January 2nd or 3rd. I was still trying to heal and rest, but my main focus shifted towards my father. He needed so much help. He couldn't walk or get himself food. And every time I had to give him a bad update from the nurse, it would kill me to give him the news in an already so fragile state. The days became a cycle of call for updates, wait, call for updates. I was having trouble sleeping. I would sleep with the phone next to me, hoping I wouldn't get a call during the night. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Galatians 2:20. It is now Wednesday, January 5th. We have been praying together as a family every day. I've never seen my dad pray so much. I would join them in prayers, but I couldn't really pray on my own as I normally would. I wasn't mad at God or anything. I was just sort of out of it. It was not a day-by-day situation we were in. It was an hour-by situation. There were moments where my dad would just cry and sob, and my prayer became to just be there for him. I was remaining so close to him that I began to feel his pain and suffer with him. At this point, my mother had been on a BiPAP machine for 13 days. It's a machine that forces air into your lungs. Because it's a little invasive, it can make it difficult for those on it to sleep. Some patients rip them off their face on day 1 because it gives them anxiety. And she was on day 13. Whenever they would try to remove the BiPAP to see if she could breathe without it, her oxygen would drop severely, and she'd have to be restabilized. At this point, we knew, because the nurses had told us previously, that the next step would be intubation. The doctors had been avoiding it because it was a little more risky. There was a chance it could heal her lungs, but there was also a chance it could make her worse. Thank God my mother had tested negative earlier in the week. It was now Friday, January 7th. My brother had already gone to see her and spoke to her. My sister had gone to see her the day after, but she was asleep and she couldn't speak to her. And it was my turn. Friday, January 7th. I called my brother and I told him, I still feel really sick, and walking more than a minute, I feel nauseous and dizzy. Maybe you should go see her again. He said, okay. he called me a little while later and said, "Hey, I know you're feeling bad, but what if something happens and you don't get another chance?" Reluctantly, I said, "Okay, maybe a part of me was scared to see her." I hadn't worn decent clothes in a few weeks, so I showered and shaved, put on decent clothes. I tried to make myself look presentable because I knew she would probably notice I had lost so much weight in a short amount of time. I didn't want her to worry. I took my rosary and some prayer books, got to the hospital, found the floor, found a room. I wasn't sure if she would be asleep, but I asked the nurse to see her. She said yes and opened the sliding glass door. "Mrs. Lopez, look who's here to see you." She turned her head and I greeted her. She tried to speak, but I didn't want her to. I just wanted her to focus on breathing. I gave her a rundown of what was happening with the family, but that we were all okay and that we were going to be fine. Dad is getting better. He's walking around slow, but he's getting better. And we just wanted her to focus on getting better. I told her she was going to come home and everything was going to be okay. And I spoke as much life into her as I could. After a while, I just became silent. I held her hand with my right hand and with my left hand caressed her hair gently to help her relax. I could hear the oxygen meter in the background. There were so many noises going off from time to time. I can see how she wasn't getting enough rest. After a while, I asked her if she wanted me to pray the rosary. She motioned yes. I held her hand as I prayed the rosary. It was Friday, so I prayed the sorrowful mysteries. I told her that I didn't want to stay long because I wanted her to rest. I kissed her on the head and told her that I loved her. She responded in a very muffled tone because of the mask, "I love you too." The next day was Saturday, the 8th. We received a call from the hospital. My mother's oxygen was in the 70s, which is not good. Before they intubate someone, they ask the patient's permission. They asked my mom, and she told them to call my son, Gabriel. I had the call on speakerphone. My father could hear the conversation. I asked the nurse, "Is this what the doctors are saying she needs at this point to have a chance?" She said yes. I said, "Okay, let's do it." Intubating someone is a very delicate procedure. There's a chance she could lose too much oxygen and die. We waited on pins and needles for the callback. The nurse called back and said the procedure went well and her oxygen was back in the 90s. We were so overjoyed and overwhelmed. My dad was crying tears of joy. But we still didn't know what was going to happen. We had known people who had been intubated for months and come out of it. And then we had heard not so great stories. It was such a stressful time. I think I was pretty much running on adrenaline at this point. A few days goes by. My mother's condition is not great, but she's holding it. It's Thursday, January 13th, my second day back at work. My aunt was in town, helping to take care of my dad. He had to be in a wheelchair, but she was going to take him to see my mom. It would be the first time to see her since she had gone to the hospital. When he got there, they had just moved her, and her oxygen had fallen too much and hadn't restabilized. He texted all of us that we needed to start praying right now. I didn't know what was happening, but when I found out, I decided to leave work. The on-duty nurse told my father that it would be a good idea if the children were here. I then drove straight to the hospital. Things were all of a sudden very serious. We all arrived very shaken up. But after a while, her oxygen stabilized in the mid-70s, which is not great. But the nurse told us, let's just wait and see what happens. I've seen people stay in the 70s for weeks in her condition, she said. So we thought, okay, there's hope. So we went home, emotionally drained and just forever in this new state of waiting, this new normal of waiting. Maybe it would be like this for weeks or months. We didn't know. All we could do was hope and pray. At 9 p.m. the same evening, all of a sudden, I hear my dad sort of yelling and crying at the same time, almost screaming. The on-duty nurse had called him and said her oxygen level was in the mid-50s and that she wouldn't last throughout the night. It was then that we all knew. I called my mom's oldest sister, my aunt, and told her the news, and to tell everyone to come see her and say goodbye if they were able. My family was the first to get there. The nurse told us so that we could understand what was happening. Her oxygen is in the 50s. She won't be able to last throughout the night. Her oxygen is eventually going to drop all the way down to 0, and her heart will expire. She wasn't being rude, she was just trying to prepare us. A lot of my aunts and uncles came in to see her. Again, many of whom I hadn't talked to. But now all that was gone. The drama, the tension on both sides disappeared. After about midnight, everyone who was not immediate family had to leave. Then it was just me, my father, and my sister. As the time passed and we waited, the past few weeks had taken a toll on me. I wanted to be there, but I felt so exhausted, still sick, still weak, still nauseous. At that time, it's after midnight. I think I had eaten a banana the whole day. I just felt terrible. I was running on fumes. I told my father, I may have to go home. I feel like I'm going to pass out. In a very gentle way, he urged me to stay. He wanted me to be there, so I was. It's a very strange and weird thing to sit, watch, and wait for your mother to die. After she was intubated, she was unconscious, so she couldn't speak, but we could speak to her with the hope she could hear us and know that she wasn't alone, that we were there with her. I could see 4 or 5 nurses outside the glass door, also watching very intently, also waiting. Slowly but surely, her oxygen fell as the hours passed. At 2:27 in the morning, her heart finally gave out, and she was gone. My father, my sister, and myself all just, crying is not the word. We were all distraught, weeping sorrowfully when it finally happened. The 4 or 5 nurses who had been watching outside, as soon as she expired, came in and removed all her monitoring pads and IVs so that we could be closer to her. They were also all crying with us, and each of them gave us their condolences. I remember sobbing and telling my dad, sorry because it was me that gave her COVID. He told me to stop and to never blame yourself, that it was the time God had planned for her to go. The funeral mass was beautiful. So many people had prayed for my mother and asked others for prayer. People in many states were praying for her. The priest at the Mass, who knew my mom very well, thanked everyone for their prayers and said, "Your prayers healed her." My flesh didn't understand, but my spirit did. And I knew exactly what he meant. I was the last one to speak to my mother. I told her that she was going to come home. And she did. Hope. I would like to share with you a few ways I experienced God during this dark time and consequently found hope. The first thing I realized after my mom passed is that I have to be good, because I want to get to heaven so I can see her again. It seemed to make heaven all the more real, more of a reality, something I can look forward to now and be less afraid of. Letting go. I remember maybe a week before my mom passed away, me and my sister drove to the parking lot of the hospital just to be near her and pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet. While we prayed, I received an image. The image was a bowl, and inside the bowl was her heart. It was a heart. Not a pretty, healthy heart, but it looked tired, almost dry, not healthy. And I received the intuition that it was my mother's heart, but I didn't want to believe it. I brushed that thought to the side as we continued to pray for her total and complete healing. No, that can't be. But as I looked back on that image after my mom passed, it gave me much comfort. God was showing me it was almost her time and how she would go. I could be tempted to think it's my fault because I gave her COVID. Or maybe if I would have taken her to a different hospital, or maybe if I would have got the needed medicine sooner. But none of that is reality. I realized that it was always going to be this way. This was God's plan from the beginning. Maybe there's something about your life that you think was unplanned, that you're tempted to think, God, was this really a part of your plan for me? It's my fault because I didn't do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to tell you what my father told me as I tried to apologize to him for giving my mom COVID. Stop it. Don't look backwards. Look forward. Count your blessings and focus on heaven. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 16. I realized the things you think matter a lot don't actually matter a lot. I remember 3 months after my mom passed, a very good friend asked me for some advice. She was having some difficulties with the way her mother was responding to a situation in her life and was quite upset with her mother. Me and my own mother, at times in my life, didn't get along well. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this on your own. And maybe you're experiencing this right now. The last 1 or 2 years she was alive, things were really great between us. And for that, I'm so grateful. The last week, she was home before she went to the hospital. It was just me and her in the living room most of the time, watching TV. She would put on whatever I wanted to watch. She really didn't care. She just wanted to sit with me. It was nice. I remember telling my friend, I can't remember any of the bad times. The arguments with my mother, all that has gone away. I can only think of her and remember her with love. Your parents are not perfect. They are just like you. Human and sinners. My mother did the best job she could with me. Not to brag, I think she did a good job. But I would give up everything I have. Everything I've accomplished. And I've accomplished a lot. I would start all over again in life if it meant I could have 1 more minute with her. Many of the things you think matter a lot don't actually matter a lot. Many of the things you have focused on for years and have worked towards have probably not made you any happier and won't get you to heaven. So what does matter? Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. It is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interest. It is not quick-tempered, and it does not brood over injuries. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. 1 Corinthians 13. Even though losing my mother to COVID was the darkest experience of my life, I still felt and saw God working in so many ways, during and after. The biggest takeaway I have from this experience is who I saw myself become during the process. Who are you when everything goes wrong? That's who you really are. When things go wrong, who you choose to be is who you really are. Sometimes we're tempted to think, am I enough? Am I worthy? If we choose to give of ourselves, will it be enough? or will we buckle under pressure? When my mother was in the hospital and I had to manage the situation and make tough decisions, while at the same time having to take care of my father, who was deathly sick and couldn't feed himself and was an emotional wreck almost every day, while also at the same time, at one point, being a few days from death myself, and then always weak and sick for weeks after. During this whole time, something awoke in me, or it seemed I had been awakened. My heart was on fire with God's love because I was practicing sacrificial love every single day to the max, to my heart's capacity. When I had barely anything to give, I would give it all. I didn't know where all the strength was coming from, but it made me feel so alive. I would feel, this is what God made me for. I can do this. And nothing makes us happier than doing God's will. In the darkest time in my life, in the most traumatic experience I've ever experienced, I found out who I am. I am enough. I have what it takes. I am capable of great love. You know, we sometimes get so caught up in the process of being Catholic, doing everything we should, focusing on crossing off the list, that we forget everything in our faith is pointing us to love. And not just puppy dog, Hollywood self-serving love. I'm talking about love so real, it hurts when you give it. And some of us have become so frustrated because we know God loves us, have experienced His love, but then don't know how to translate that love to others. Let me close by saying this. Men, you have a capacity for great love. Real, sacrificial, authentic love that can not only transform your life, but the lives of everyone around you. Women, you have a capacity for great love. There is nothing God made in this world more valuable than your hearts, because your love can change everything it touches. If you don't choose to be the person God created you to be, someone will suffer. The people in your life, God has placed them there for a reason. And He is calling you to love. Then Jesus said to His disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me.